Who was Nicolae Ceausescu? How did he rise from humble beginnings in rural Romania to the very top of the country's post-war communist regime? And what led to his dramatic fall in 1989? Let's find out on today's episode of the History Chronicles. The Romanian communist politician and dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was officially born on the 5th of February 1918 in the village of Scornicest in the northern part of Olt County, Romania. This date has been subject to some confusion, however, partially owing to the adoption of the new style calendar in Romania in 1919, which advanced the date 13 days, and the claim by Ceausescu himself that he was born 3 days after his birth certificate stated. His father was Andrucea Ceausescu, a farmer with a humble stock of animals and one-time mayor of Scornicest, who backed the Peasants' Party of Romania, a left-wing populist movement which advocated for cooperative farms and left-wing corporatism. It was alleged by the Romanian press in the 1990s that Andrucea was an alcoholic who would routinely beat his wife and family. His mother was Alexandrina Alexandra, who was noted for her religious piety, leading Nicolae later in his life to construct a church in her memory after she had died, despite his own atheism. Nicolae Ceausescu's childhood remains somewhat of a mystery, and has been subject to great press speculation, which was particularly prevalent in the aftermath of his fall from power. It was reported that Ceausescu ran away from his abusive father after his 11th birthday and travelled to work as a shoemaker in the workshop of Alexandru Sandulescu. Sandulescu was the man credited with introducing Ceausescu to far-left ideologies, he himself being an illicit member of the banned Communist Party. Ceausescu was soon after arrested for street fighting during a strike and joined the Communist Party in 1932. By the mid-1930s, Ceausescu had become deeply involved in Communist Party agitation, a secret police file naming him a dangerous agitator and recording his activities as a distributor of communist and anti-fascist literature, crimes for which he was imprisoned in 1936 and then released in 1939. Very soon after being released, Ceausescu was once again arrested and imprisoned for conspiracy to violate the social order, serving much of this prison time during the Second World War, and using this time to network with other communist and left-wing agitators, such as Gheorghe Georgiu Dej, who would later become the first communist leader of Romania. Ceausescu, alongside his fellow communist inmates in the Târgu Jiu internment camp, used this time to read the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin, and planned their political futures along these lines, in an orthodoxy overseen by Gheorghe Georgiu Dej. Once the war had concluded, Romania progressively fell under the influence of the USSR, and in 1947 the Communist Party seized power completely with the overthrow of King Michael I, who was forced to abdicate after members of the pro-communist Tudor Vladimirescu division had surrounded his Elizabeta Palace in Bucharest, led by Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej. Gheorghe Georgiu Dej rewarded Ceausescu for his loyalty to the cause and made him head of the Ministry of Agriculture and a major general in the army. After a series of purges in the early 1950s, Ceausescu was promoted further and made a member of the Central Committee, a reward aided by the fact that Ceausescu had not fled to the USSR during the war and had remained close to Georgiu Dej. In 1965, Georgiu Dej died, leaving a power vacuum in the Communist Party and no obvious successor. After a period of intense internal conflict, senior members of the party turned to Ceausescu as a compromise candidate, leading to his promotion to General Secretary on the 22nd of March 1965. Immediately after gaining power, Ceausescu engaged in a ruthless campaign of power consolidation, declaring that Romania was a socialist republic rather than a people's republic, and centralizing his power by appointing himself President of the State Council, a move which made him, in practice, the head of state. His political opponents were rounded up and imprisoned. Ceausescu's relatively antagonistic foreign policy toward the USSR made him a more palatable figure for NATO states, a popularity which was furthered in the late 1960s with his decision to end press censorship and withdraw Romania from the Warsaw Pact, in all but name. He formally condemned the Soviet-led 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia and travelled to Prague in its aftermath to console the Czechoslovakian leader Alexandra Dubček, stating, "The incursion in Czechoslovakia of the troops belonging to the 5 socialist countries represents a big mistake and a serious threat to peace in Europe and for the destiny of socialism in the world." Despite these more progressive acts, Ceausescu enforced a program of highly conservative social policies on the domestic stage, banning abortion and contraception, with women suffering miscarriages inspected by the police under suspicion of having had an abortion, and those without children interrogated about their sexual and personal lives. In 1966, Decree 770 was introduced in Romania, which introduced a system of reward for mothers who had more than 5 children, and commanded that women were to be monitored monthly by a gynecologist, contraceptives effectively banned, and pregnancies monitored for their duration. These highly controlling policies led to a swell in the Romanian population, which was tragically reflected in the massive increase in number of children being admitted to orphanages, with parental abandonment becoming a serious problem. Many children in this system suffered considerably as a result of their experiences. During the 1970s, Ceausescu furthered his policies of openness toward NATO and the West, becoming one of the first Warsaw Pact states to recognize the legitimacy of West Germany and the first to receive a US president, Richard Nixon. In 1971, Romania joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, and signed treaties with the European Economic Area. These political deals were furthered with a series of executive tours, designed to show Ceausescu as an open and practical communist leader, undertaking a separate program from the USSR and wishing to be seen as an international statesman. Ceausescu visited the US, the UK, Spain and Australia in a bid to be recognised as a serious and amicable political leader, eager to advance Romania's international reputation and standing. Despite the international image he wished to project, Ceausescu developed a conventional communist economy on the domestic stage, continuing Georgiu Dege's program of intensive industrialization and relying heavily on the peasantry in order to facilitate this, and leading to a dual class of citizen who acted both as a member of the peasantry and of the industrial working class. Social standards improved notably during the late 1960s and early 1970s, with universities and training centres established in many towns. The World Health Organization recognized improvements in state medical provision and improved living conditions, facilitated by higher salaries and an expansion of state social care provision, including pensions, universal education, and retirement care. In 1971, Ceausescu toured Asian communist states such as China, North Korea, and North Vietnam, developing a close rapport with leaders such as Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong, and becoming an admirer of their well-developed cults of personality and their capacity to operate independently of the Soviet Union. Indeed, this admiration led Ceausescu to emulate not only the doctrine of the cult of personality, but also the North Korean Juche ideology of self-reliance and Maoism, ordering the translation of relevant ideological materials into Romanian and distributing them around the country. In July 1971, Ceausescu delivered a speech to the Executive Committee of the Communist Party of Romania and declared a series of ideological proposals in a highly Maoist style, known as the July Theses. The July Theses ushered in a new period of repression and state control, with an intensification of ideological grooming in schools, an increase in the propensity of partisan children's and youth organizations, and an expansion of political propaganda, with plays, musical shows, ballet and artwork geared to this end. The Theses led to a wider attack on cultural autonomy in Romania and worked to centralize the arts, education, literature and leisure activities to the party and the communist ideology, with strict ideological conformity demanded from people at all levels of society. In 1974, the party declared that they would increase the intensity with which they pursued this program and began their attempts to merge the state, its ideology, and society. 1974 also saw Ceausescu convert his post to that of President of the Socialist Republic of Romania, a formal transition of his position into one of executive political dominance, and one into which he was re-elected every 5 years until 1989. This move permitted him to rule increasingly through decree and centralize greater power from the State Council to his own personal office, meaning that his decisions had the force of law, if he so desired. During the 1973 to 1974 oil embargo, Ceausescu made sure to take advantage of Romania's position as a key manufacturer of oil refining equipment, and began to heavily invest in oil refining plants, spending the windfall from this program on aid programs to the Third World, which he hoped would increase Romania's prestige and influence. However, the effectiveness of these investments was seriously limited by the lack of productivity of Romanian workers, meaning that plans for oil refineries were completed years behind schedule. This program was further set back by a 1977 earthquake, which destroyed much of Bucharest. Indeed, by the time many of these plants had been completed, oil prices had slumped, and many of the investments made by the Romanian government, backed by loans from the West, had become losses. The late 1970s were rocked by further problems for the Ceausescu regime, when 30,000 miners went on strike, owing to poor working conditions and a lack of pay. It was later claimed that various union leaders had been given 5-minute chest x-rays in order to cause cancer, and the strikes were weathered by the government. Foreign policy remained an area of great success for Ceausescu, who travelled to the UK in 1978 to sign a contract with British Aerospace to the tune of £200 million. A trip which saw him awarded a knighthood by the Queen and made history as the first leader of a communist country to make a state visit of this kind. Domestic policy remained an area of concern into the 1980s and was characterised by a 1986 referendum which saw the state determined to pay off all foreign debt incurred by the country, an ambition which dominated much of Romania's political programme toward the end of the decade. The focus on repaying foreign debt meant that domestic spending and stimulus was limited, leading to a period of economic stagnation and setting the stage for an economic crisis. Household energy use was severely limited by the state, and increased material costs were not alleviated, leading to a decline in industrial output toward the end of the 1980s. In 1987, the pressure caused by these economic policies was sufficient to warrant a rebellion. Brasov, a major industrial centre, saw 20,000 workers mobilise against Ceausescu's policies of rationing, energy and food consumption restrictions, and lowered income, which was only quelled when the armed forces and the secret police surrounded the city centre and arrested some 300 protesters, accused of disturbing the public peace, many of whom were later subject to torture and excessive prison sentences, which ran between 6 months and 3 years. Poorly planned economic policies, seditious political movements amongst the population, and a general decline in living conditions characterised the final years of the regime, which drew to a dramatic close in 1989. November 1989 saw Ceausescu re-elected as president and give a speech denouncing the anti-communist revolutions occurring across the Eastern Bloc. By December 1989, Romania was one of the only remaining hardline communist states in the Warsaw Pact, and Ceausescu's reign was in its twilight. In mid-December 1989, protests ignited across the country in response to the government's attempt to evict Laszlo Tokes, an ethnic Hungarian pastor who had been accused by the state of inciting ethnic hatred. Protesters who had gathered locally to defend Tokes were joined by many others, notably a group of Romanian students who used this as an opportunity to oppose the government more widely. This protest was regarded as a serious threat by the Romanian police and armed forces, who fired on protesters and killed numerous men, women, and children who had been peacefully demonstrating against the state. Ceausescu himself had gone to Iran for a state visit and returned on the 20th of December to widespread opposition. In an attempt to quell the national mood, Ceausescu staged a demonstration of support in Bucharest, designed to look like a spontaneous march in support of the regime. Romanian citizens circumvented state propaganda by accessing Western media and independent news outlets, which broadcast information about anti-Ceausescu movements across the country. This demonstration, held on the 21st of December, was addressed by Ceausescu in Revolution Square, where he began to deliver a speech which closely resembled his other addresses, speaking of the achievements of the socialist revolution and the communist government. The crowd responded poorly and began to chant insults and booed. Ceausescu attempted to order calm by raising his right hand. However, the crowd continued to bellow and chant, with Ceausescu's offer of increased wages shouted down by protesters. This having failed, Ceausescu retreated and took cover in the building of the Central Committee. The 22nd of December brought a full-blown crisis. Ceausescu's defence minister, Perfil, had committed suicide, although his death was reported as an assassination, turning much of the army against Ceausescu, with protests spreading to all cities in Romania. Ceausescu attempted a final speech, although he soon had to take cover as protesters hurled projectiles at him. Soon after, Ceausescu gathered his wife, and managed to escape from the roof of the building via helicopter. This period of protest had an estimated death toll of over 1,000 people, many of whom were victims of violence perpetrated by the secret police in an attempt to retain control. Ceausescu ordered his helicopter to fly to his residence in Snagov, and then on to Targovište, where he was finally ordered to land by the army, as they had entered restricted airspace covered by the now hostile armed forces. Ceausescu and his wife were held by the police for a short time after landing, following which they were handed over to the army. On Christmas Day, Ceausescu stood trial in a small room before members of the army and the new provisional government. He stood accused of genocide and the illegal accruement of wealth, quickly being found guilty and sentenced to death by execution. Ceausescu demanded that he and his wife be shot alongside one another, to which the soldiers agreed, tying their hands behind their backs and placing them against a wall. Ceausescu sang the Internationale immediately before he was executed by firing squad. Ceausescu's execution was filmed and broadcast on Romanian TV as a definitive sign of the end of the regime and the triumph of protesters. Ceausescu and his wife were originally buried in plain graves, although whether or not the graves were genuine remained unclear for some time. Later DNA examinations of the bodies verified that it was in fact Nicolae. Indeed, his corpse still wore the blue coat he had donned before his execution. His family organised a formal burial once this conclusion had been reached, and they were reburied at a cemetery in Ghensia. Ceausescu is remembered as a particularly hardline communist leader who was willing to put his population under enormous pressure and hardship to pursue his ambitions. His brutality and his fall from power are amongst some of the most potent memories which remain of his rule, and footage of his final speeches are some of the most powerful imagery associated with the fall of communism in Europe. What are your opinions on Nicolae Ceausescu? Was he a ruthless and opportunist dictator, or a passionate believer in communism who climbed to the very top of the political system from extremely humble origins? We would love to know what you think in the comments section. You've been watching the History Chronicles. Please like and subscribe to